But tonight's topic, in case you didn't know, I'm going to be talking about the Neanderthals, the Nephilim, and the other races of the Bible. And I've not heard anyone else address this topic, and I cover topics that other people don't. But this topic has been very, very misunderstood. There have been a lot of misconceptions about it, and I want to try to clear that up. That's why I want to talk about this. And a lot of people have made a lot of wild assumptions based on little or no information. And they've inserted a lot of racist ideology into the Bible, even though the Bible actually says very little about the subject of race. It doesn't use the term race as we know it. It doesn't divide people into colors. It doesn't use the terms black, white, red, or yellow like people do in our society. But people have inserted that into the Bible time and again. So what does it really say? Now, I want to say that there's one theory that I'm familiar with, that maybe you're familiar with, that I've seen on YouTube and elsewhere that goes way back, is the theory that Adam and Eve were the first white people, and then the other races went back before Adam and Eve. That's been around over a century. But what does the Bible say about that? Does the Bible say there were other people around before Adam and Eve? Does the Bible say what color Adam and Eve were? No, it doesn't say that. So we want to look at what the Bible says, and then we want to link it to science, because in this case, science actually does corroborate the Bible. Now, many years ago, I used to be a member of an all-black church. And the pastor was born in Alabama in June of 1932, and he grew up in a very racist environment, and I think he had a grudge with white people, and he thought that the different races were all created separately. And if I'd have heard that from a white guy, I'd think this guy's a real racist. Well, I guess he had his reasons, but I disputed with him, and I brought up Genesis 3:20, and that's where I want to start here. And what does it say? It says, and Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Now, this shows us clearly that all people on the earth today descended from Adam and Eve. Now, people have a hard time believing that all the different races could have possibly descended from two people. We have a lot of diversity on the earth in terms of humanity. And people can't believe they could have all descended from two people. But that's what the Bible tells us, and it's been corroborated by science, because in the last 30 years, science has finally figured out conclusively from DNA evidence that every human being that's alive in the world today has descended from just two people. That's one thing they got right. The races were not created separately. And just remember, there's a massive amount of information in the DNA molecule. And about 97% of our DNA is not even used. And also, living things lose genetic information from one generation to another, so Adam and Eve would have had a lot more genetic information than we do. And there's trillions and trillions of different combinations. So we have that here, Genesis 3:20. Eve was the mother of all living. Now, I brought this up to my former pastor. He died over 4.5 years ago. And he said that, well, the word Adam means man, and Eve that's Isha, that means woman. He said that, well, that means mankind and womankind. But now clearly you can see that this is talking about two individual people. Adam called his wife's name Eve. This is not talking about womankind and mankind in general. It's talking about two people. Then we'll fast forward to the flood, because as we know, humanity was wiped out except for apparently 8 people. Now, this same pastor, this man, he was black. He claimed that, he said that Noah was supposed to take 2 of every kind with him on the ark. He thought that included human beings as well as animals. And he thought that each of the different basic races, as we now call them, was included on the ark. Well, that's not what it says in 1 Peter 3:20, so let's look there. And now it says, Noah, while in the ark being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. It specifically says 8. And that's pretty clear. There were no more than 8 people on that ark. Now, granted, then there's another theory about this that I think that is wrong. And the management here at WALS doesn't want me to mention a certain name, but he was the leader of a certain church that we used to belong to, and he thought that that the races were preserved because he thought that that Noah and his wife were white, and his 3 sons were all white, and that that Ham married a black woman, and Japheth married an Oriental woman, and that's how the races were preserved. Well, that doesn't really fit. I don't think that's what happened. Now, first of all, this same man claimed that the main reason for the flood and the main reason for the problems before the flood was because of interracial marriage. He thought that's what Genesis 6 was talking about. Well, he's contradicting himself. He thought the reason for the flood was because of interracial marriage, and he's trying to tell us that 2 of the marriages on the people on the ark were interracial. It doesn't make sense. No, he was wrong at both counts. He's wrong about Genesis 6. He's wrong about the people on the ark. Now, we got to be careful about what it actually says. It doesn't say what color Adam and Eve were. It doesn't say what the people on the ark looked like. Now, by the way, there is one theory that I think kind of makes sense, is that this is somebody that I saw on WVCY years ago, a long time ago, and he was saying that he thought Adam and Eve had light brown skin, and that would have given them the genetics to have to spawn all different kinds of races. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think it's plausible. But as far as the idea that Adam and Eve were the first white people and everybody else was different, it doesn't say that. And it doesn't say that there were people before them. So we got to avoid that kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of idea that racism kind of comes from. By the way, this minister that I'm referring to, that was a leader of a certain church, was born in 1892, and he grew up in a very racist world. And he did not have access to the kind of archaeological and scientific information that we do. So you have to take that into account as well. So when we get to the flood, humanity is wiped out. Humanity is preserved through 3 couples. Now, we don't know what they looked like. I don't think they looked that much different. And it wasn't really necessary for them to. And by the way, I don't think that humanity was as diverse back before the flood as it is now. The population was obviously a lot smaller. No, I don't know exactly what people looked like back then. But now there's over 7.5 billion people on the planet. And we're talking about they came out of just those 8 people. I actually really, Noah didn't have any kids after the flood. So it came from 3 couples. Now, was it necessary for them to look that much different? No, it wasn't, because like I said, there's massive amounts of information in the human DNA. Most of it's not used. Then you have dominant and recessive genes. And the different races, I think, formed out of geographic isolation. And God specifically wanted people to become dispersed after the flood. And at first, I guess they did disperse, but then they came back together at Babylon. God had to divide them again, and he divided up the languages so that they would become dispersed. That's how the different races, I think, formed. And there is plenty of information in the human DNA to do that is scientifically verifiable. And you know, Christians and non-Christians alike have tried to say, oh no, there's no way humanity could have come from 2 people. It did. And it's been verified. All right. Now, when we look at the people that were on the ark, well, we got Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, the Bible does tell us a bit about who their descendants were. And in the case of Ham, his descendants included Ethiopia, Egypt, and Canaan. And I will say, Ham and his descendants don't really have a very good reputation in the Bible. And I'm not trying to paint everybody with the same brush. That's one of the points I want to make today, is you can't do that. However, they were occupying the land of Canaan, and the Israelites were told to conquer that land, and they were told to kill those people. Now, the Israelites have been portrayed as aggressive, brutal people. They were slaughtering all these innocent people, men, women, and children, taking their land. Well, there were a very good reason for that. They were not innocent people. Their sins were enumerated, starting in, well, we got, was it Numbers 18? Where did I write it? Yeah, let's go to Numbers 18. Well, no, that's not it. No, Deuteronomy 18. I'm sorry. Well, there's the whole laundry list of forms of. Well, okay, no. In this case, Deuteronomy 18. It talks about the wicked customs of the Canaanites. When you come into the land which the Lord has given you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of these nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire, or who practices witchcraft, or a soothsayer, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritualist, or one who calls up the dead. For all who do these things are an abomination to the Lord, and because of these abominations, the Lord your God drives them out before you. All right, these are the practices that they were doing that God hated. Then there's Leviticus 18, starting in verse 1. It goes through. All right, it goes through the list of all different forms of sexual immorality. I'm not going to go through the whole list. Homosexuality is one of them. But I'll go to verse 24, Leviticus 18:24. Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these the nations are defiled, for which I am casting out before you. These were not innocent victims. Now, you could say these are descendants of Ham, but these are not all the same kind of people. Now, I also want to point out that there was a loophole, because when they went into the land of Canaan, there was an exception. And where was it? If you found a woman that you wanted to marry among these people, if she was still a virgin, you could do it. And where was that? That was in, all right, Numbers 31, 17 and 18. If you found a woman among these, you could marry her. Well, she was a descendant of Ham. So it wasn't really about race. And that's another point that I'm going to get to later. It's not like that there is such a thing as racial purity, because there's really no scientific definition for racial purity. And that's one of the points that I want to make today. It's really about a belief, not race. Not about just Israel. And then, okay, now I want to backtrack here. No, wait, I want to go ahead to the New Testament. All right. Oh, wait, no. Like I said, okay, there was an exception. If you wanted to marry her, you could do that. Now, then we can look at Numbers 12. And what happened in there? In the wilderness period, Moses married an Ethiopian woman, a Cushite, and his brother and sister were so upset about it, they didn't want to deal with him anymore. They'd had it with them. Now I'll just pick up the story. I'll just read it to you. Where did I put it? It's a kind of a funny story, in my opinion. And then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married. For he had married an Ethiopian woman. And he said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than all the men who were on the face of the earth. Suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out of you there to the tabernacle of the meeting. So the three came out. And the Lord came down in the pillar of the cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam, and both of them went forward. He said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision, and I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly, not in the dark sayings, and he sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Well, God was not angry with Moses because he had married this woman. But Aaron and Miriam were. They thought, oh, you can't, she's black. How can you do this? Well, she was part of that mixed multitude that came out of Egypt. And like I said, it's not about race, it's about belief. And yes, the Israelites were told, you don't marry these Gentiles, but it wasn't because of their race, it was because of their pagan religion. This woman was not a pagan. She had adopted the religion of Israel. She was a follower of Yahweh. And there's really no such thing as racial purity. She was just as acceptable to the Lord as anyone else. But what do we have here? They already had a problem with her appearance. And that was also a problem in the New Testament period. Now I'm going to go to Galatians 3:28 and 29. Now these are very important verses which tend to get overlooked, especially by people that are almost obsessed with Israel. They think it's all about Israel. All right, now Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in what? Israel? No, we're not one in Israel, we're one in Christ. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Now, you can be a descendant of Abraham and not be an heir according to the promise. You can be a Gentile who's not a descendant of Abraham, and then you can be an heir according to the promise if you are a Christian. That's what it's saying. And you don't have to be grafted into Israel. Only a small percentage of Israel is going to be in the first resurrection. Now, just remember that Abraham's seed includes the Arabs, and they're not heirs according to any promise. So, and then also I want to point out Romans 11:7. Israel has not obtained what it seeks, but the elect have obtained it. And the elect is the church. That's where it's at. If you want to be an Israelite, you have to be grafted into Israel. But if you want to be a Christian, that's different. Now, you can call that replacement theology. You can call it whatever you want, but that's what it said. All right, now I want to go to Acts 26-39, and that is the story of where the Apostle Philip met with an Ethiopian eunuch who was on his way back from one of the feast days in Jerusalem. And this man had a scroll of the book of Isaiah. Philip interpreted it for him. He was interpreting what is now known as Isaiah 52 and 53, the main messianic prophecy in there, and he had no way of knowing this at that time. Now, why would an Ethiopian be attending the feast days, right? Well, they've been doing that for a long time. In fact, to my knowledge, Ethiopia has had the longest unbroken streak of Sabbath and holiday keepers, or at least Sabbath keepers, in human history. And I think that, to my knowledge, that's the oldest nation that has not been moved since the flood. They've been in the same place since the flood. And even the Egyptians. Apparently, David Anthony had said that the Egyptians were displaced by Arabs. I don't know if that's the case or not, but that's what I've heard. But the Ethiopians have been in the same place almost since the flood. And there have been Jews and Christians there for a long time. And God is still working with them. He acknowledges them, and that's why he sent Philip to preach to them. All right, now let's go to Acts 10, 34 and 35. This is the Apostle Peter preaching to a Gentile, in this case Cornelius, a Roman soldier. He said to him, "In truth I perceive that God shows no partiality. He's not a respecter of persons, but in every nation, whomever fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him." Now that was a new idea to people at that time, because the Jews were pretty racist. And at that time, you were either a Jew or you were a pagan, and there was no in between. There was no alternative. And they had a hard time dealing with the idea that a Gentile could be a good person. But they were starting to adjust to that. Now, let's go to Revelation 7:9. This is talking about the multitude that comes out of the tribulation. "After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could number, of all nations, tribes of peoples and tongues, standing before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands." It says all nations and all tribes, all people. Everybody's included. God is not just working with a tiny segment of humanity. He has a plan for everybody. Now, he chose to work with Israel first. He gave the law to Israel first, but he wants everyone to keep it. And these are not Jewish laws. These are God's laws, and anyone can keep them. So I think we all get that one. Now, this is the Greek word ethnos, which it's translated as nation. It's the basis of the word ethnic group. But like I said, the word race is really not in the Bible. There's the word for foot race, then there's the word genos, which is kind of like the word race. It's only used 4 times. But it's not really talking about colors like we know them. All right. All right, let's go to 1 John 4:20. If someone says, "I love God," and hates his brother, he is a liar. Well, we've had a big problem with racism around the world, especially in this country. It's been a dark chapter where there's been a lot of segregation. And it's made and we're still living with the aftershocks of that, even though it's gotten better. But like I said, my late pastor, that was the late John Pittman. He grew up in Alabama back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and he grew up in a world where you had separate entrances to theaters. You had the colored entrance, the white entrance. You had separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, and so on. And the schools were all segregated. And then you had lynchings, where people were strung up and hung for crimes that they might have been accused of. They weren't given the right of due process. Well, I guess that made an impression on them. And I remember I've seen an old picture from the early mid '60s where a woman was holding. She was a protester at a demonstration, a black woman, and it had that. It didn't cite the verse, but it said, "How can a man say he loves God and hate his brother?" Well, that's a good point. And I really think that the solution to the world's race problems is called Christianity. It's called treating others the way you want to be treated, but people don't do that. Okay, you can call it. I mean, these are people that call themselves Christians, but what do? They abuse others. So it's really a kind of, they're making a mockery of Christianity in a way. All right, now I'm going to go to. Is there any comments so far?
Okay, I have to, everyone can unmute themselves. I muted everybody, but I did it so you could unmute. If you're on the phone, it's *6. Unmute your phone. Is that what we discussed earlier? *6. So any comments? There's also a chat room. You can type in the chat room if you don't want to actually ask a question.
And the space bar.
Okay. Also, if you press on your space bar, it will unmute you as long as you press down. Any comments?
Mark, what was the verse about how no one could appear before the Lord to the 10th generation.
I
Something
didn't
to that.
mention that.
Were you getting to that or no?
No.
Yeah, we had a gentleman that we met with many, many, many years ago who brought up the same issue, and basically saying that he was using the 10th generation rule, as a support for his racist views. And then we threw out there, well, what about Ruth? I mean, David technically was fourth generation, so how could he stand before the Lord if, race was an issue?
Oops.
And then so what it pointed to was because Ruth said, let your people be my people, let your God be my God. She, in essence, was grafting herself in, and it was not an issue, like you're saying.
Hmm.
God doesn't, he looks at the heart, not at the melanin.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
I think I did a study on that one time, Jim Steinley here, and I think there was like somewhere around 189 years between the time that was said to the time of the Moabites, Moabite Ruth, and which would allow 10 generations actually to go by before, if there certainly was a possibility for it, at least for it to allow 10 generations to go by before she was grafted in.
Yeah, my point was, though, that you had Ruth, then you had Obed, then you had Jesse, and then David, so that's technically 4 generations. So, just throwing that out there.
All right.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
Mark, this is Al Turner. Getting back to the statements you made about everyone having a common ancestor. In Acts 17, were you going to go to Acts 17, 26?
No.
Okay.
Bring it on.
It says here, and he's talking to the people in, I think in Athens here, and has made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on the face of the earth. So just kind of like in addition to what you said earlier.
Okay, good. Well, at this point, I wanted to mention something about the so-called Neanderthals. And that's one of the main topics that I wanted to cover today. Now, people don't think that the Neanderthals are mentioned in the Bible, but that term was not used until the 19th century. So what were they? There's been a lot of myths about this. Now, there has been studies on the DNA of these things. Now, these so-called Neanderthal skeletons were not, the first one was found in the 1860s in Germany. And just remember that Darwin's book, The Origin of the Species, came out in 1859. And he was trying to say that we were descendants of apes. So when people started finding these skeletons, they just assumed that they were halfway between apes and humans, and that's the way they were portrayed in artist conceptions. They were portrayed as being covered with hair. That is a complete myth that has been disproven through DNA evidence. They were not covered with hair. Now, what exactly were they? Well, first of all, they were not primates. They buried their own dead, which animals don't do. Primates don't do that. They also had some primitive stone tools. So what were they? Now, some of you know who Ken Ham is. He's an excellent speaker. He's been tearing apart evolution for a long time. His theory on this, I think, is accurate, is that these were actually pre-flood human beings. They were just very old human beings. That's all that they were. Now, they apparently walked with a stoop. Well, that's what happens when you get old. I'm only 54. I'm already starting to walk with a stoop. What if you live several hundred years? And then another thing is that they had thicker foreheads. The bone in their foreheads were thicker. Well, the older you get, the thicker your forehead gets. That explains it. because they were just very old
Bone
humans.
does thicken over time.
What? Now, another thing is that, like I said, that they were not hairy. They were more muscular, apparently. Now, another thing is that supposedly these things go back about 400,000 years. And they disappeared about 30 to 40,000 years ago. However, these dates are not reliable because I can tell you, first of all, there's only a little more than 400 of these things that have been found. They were found in Europe and in Western Asia. And if these things lived over 350,000 years, you would think you would find hundreds of thousands of these things by now, but there's only been about 400 of them found. So they weren't that prolific because they didn't live that long. Now, when you come with the way that they're dating these things, I can tell you it's not a reliable dating method, and they've been trying to tell it's the same kind of problem that they've got with dating fossils. They were trying
Radiocarbon dating.
Right. Okay. The only reliable method of dating something scientifically is through radiocarbon-14, but that is only good for about 50,000 years. You go back before that, the carbon-14 will all be gone. So how do you come up with these numbers going way back? That's just a guesstimate. They're not that old. And now, when it comes to the fossils, they were trying to tell us these things have been tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years old. Well, it turns out there's soft tissue inside of them and radiocarbon-14 inside of them, which proves that they're less than 50,000 years old, even the ones in the lower layers of the fossil record. Well, they're not. This has been known since 2003, but they will not admit to it. They're so dishonest and so headstrong. They're going to keep handing you these same old dates of tens of millions, of 50 million, they're supposedly over 65 million years minimum. And even though the evidence is clear, staring them right in the face, they won't admit to it. So you can't take these dates too seriously.
Well, to support that, Mark, they've actually found soft tissue with dinosaur bones and skin. So if supposedly that is 65 million years old, how does that survive?
Right.
The other is we've got circular reasoning. We have layers of strata that basically we're told that the layer tells you how old it is, but then you're told how old the strata is by the fossil that's in it.
Right.
And it completely defeats the purpose of the whole archaeology and geology. The other problem that you have is when you have some of these trees that cross the strata that are petrified. It points to a cataclysmic event that created layers from a flood, but no one really wants to go there because then that creates a level of accountability from a overall creator or designer, if you will. But that being said, completely supporting your thesis that the modern methods of dating are suspect, but let's, going forward, how does this kind of support your premise that race is irrelevant?
Well,
I'm trying to bring it back to the original topic.
I'm just saying that we are not that the Neanderthals were not a hybrid of apes, and we're not. I mean, it's not like we're descendants from apes. They're trying to tell us that Neanderthals were half ape and half human, and that we're descendants of Neanderthals. That's not true. And like I said, it's been scientifically verified that everybody in the world is descended from two people. But they've twisted things around and try to say that the Neanderthals were part ape and that these are our ancestors in a way they were, but they were not ape-like creatures. Also, what you were saying about these tree trunks, those are called stills, and I talked about this at the feast over a year ago at Geiger's. They permeate all the layers of the fossil record, which proves that this had to have formed all at once. Not only that, there's soft tissue that have been found in the fossils in all the layers of the fossil record, which proves that it was formed at the same time. They're not going to tell you that, man. And then if you try to tell the truth, you'll be laughed off the campus, you'll be fired. But the scientific evidence is right there in their face. I don't know how these people live with themselves, but these scientists, they live and die by the opinions of others. It's a pack mentality. But the truth is going to get out eventually, and it's not that hard to see. You don't have to be a scientist to put 2 and 2 together. All right, so that's about all that I had to say about the Neanderthals. And with that, I want to go on to part 2 of this presentation, which is going to get a little more controversial. And I know some of you are not going to agree with me on this, but I do have my reasons to let me state my case. And I know I'm used to people disagreeing with me, and that's okay. I can deal with that. But I want to.
Hey, before you go.
Yeah.
Hey, my name's Chris. Nice to meet you. Hey, the thing you said earlier about, you used to be in a church that taught that the 3 different races came from Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Yeah.
That didn't originate in that church. That's a Jewish. You just go to JewishEncyclopedia.com and look it up. The gentleman or the guy you were quoting ripped that off. That's just that's in Josephus. It's in Jewish Encyclopedia, and it does trace back to, in their legend, that the Tower of Babel, when he confused the languages, that he scattered the people, and that's why they grew up in different regions. So
Yeah, well, that guy ripped
it doesn't really change anything. Yeah. What was that?
He ripped a lot of things off. All the truth that he taught, he learned from other people, but he wouldn't cite sources. He never mentioned G.G. Rupert or J.H. Allen, for one thing. But I can go on about that.
Yeah.
No surprise there.
But I just wanted to say that that's not that. I mean, it's not relevant. And what you're saying about being grafted into the vine is absolutely the way to go. That's the way, Yah can raise up children of Abraham from stones. But I just wanted to say that that was another point that the guy ripped off, and it's a very old concept. But again, it doesn't really matter, other than to say, why do we have all black people show up in Africa, and all Asian people show up in Asia, and then you know what I mean? People are kind of grouped together, and there may be a root cause to that was the result of the scattering at the Tower of Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all.
Before we move on to part 2, is there any other comments or questions? And again, for the phone, it's *6 to unmute. We got one phone that's not muted. Well, based on the silence, there's either no comments or they don't want to say anything.
All right, good. That's good. All right, now I'm going to go back to Genesis 6. And this one, I'm going to be talking about the Nephilim. And I'm just going to start reading in verse 1. Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and the daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful. And they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Now, verse 4, here's where it gets really interesting. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children unto them. Those were the mighty men, were of old, men of renown. That's the New King James translation. Now that word, giants, as you probably know, is the word Nephilim. And it doesn't literally mean giant, it means fallen ones, or those who came down. Now it's translated as giant because that is what they were. And it works both ways. Now, what exactly were these things? Well, I think the connection here, the connecting point that we've got to look at is Numbers 13:33, because this word Nephilim is only used 3 times in the Bible. And 2 of them are in Numbers 13:33. Now, this is very interesting. I'm just going to go ahead and read it. And there we saw, okay, now this is when the spies went to the land of Canaan. And what they reported was very alarming to them. All right, I think I'll start at verse 32. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, so we were in their sight. Now, people have disregarded this as just some crazy talk. Well, no, it wasn't crazy talk. They saw actual giants, and if you saw what they saw, I think you would have been pretty intimidated too. Now, it talks about the sons of Anak. Now, here's what's the point here. First of all, the word giants here in 33, it's the word Nephilim. And there's another word here used to describe that's also translated as giant. It's the word Rapha, R-A-P-A-H, right? R-A-P-H-A-H in the Hebrew. That word is used 18 times. It's always used as the word giant. Now, the sons of Anak are described as both Rapha and Nephilim in the same verse. Now, that means that those two words are synonymous. They're interchangeable. Rapha and Nephilim are the same thing. Now, that's very important. So, these things were literal giants. Now, some people have thought, they're like a certain person looked at Genesis 6 and he said, well, this is talking about different races intermarrying. Well, it doesn't say what these beings looked like in terms of their color. But all it does give us in terms of a physical description is that they were giants. They were physically huge. Now, the physical evidence for this exists far and wide. Their skeletons have been found. Now, of course, we know that Goliath was approximately 10.5 feet tall. He was about twice the size of the average Israelite. That's in the Bible. Now we want to look at Deuteronomy 21, 10 through 13. There's another group called E-M-I-M. They said they were as tall as the Anakim. So that was another group of giants. And there were at least 7 groups, 7 different communities living in Canaan. At least 2 of them were giants. There were the Horites in Mount Sierra, but they were, I guess, already gone before the Israelites got there. They were giants. And these things did exist. But it goes beyond the Middle East. In fact, they've even been found here in America and even as close as the great state of Wisconsin. And there's numerous accounts of this. And it's really stunning. And I did not know about this until the late Rich Daniels sent me an article back in January of 2013 called The Giants of Wisconsin. About 18 giant skeletons that were found along Lake Delavan in 1912. This was reported in the New York Times on May 4th of that year. These things were up to 10 feet tall. They had elongated skulls. They had extra fingers and extra toes. They had 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. And they had double rows of teeth. Well, how do you account for this? Well, let's look at 2 Samuel 20. If I can find it here. All right. Where did I put it? All right. I didn't mark it. No, 2 Samuel 21. All right. All right. All right, I'm going to pick it up in verse 15. When the Philistines were at war with Israel, David and his servants went with him down and fought against the Philistines, and David grew faint. Then Ishbi-Benob, who was one of the sons of the giant, that's Rapha, the weight of those whose bronze spear was was 300 shekels, who was bearing a new sword, thought he could kill David. But Abishishi, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and struck the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David swore to him, saying, "You shall go out no more with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." Now we'll go down to verse 20. Yet again there was a battle in Gath. where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. He also was born to the giant. Right, so we've got these skeletons that have been found even here in Wisconsin. Now there's all these ancient legends, Indian legends, about so-called 6-fingered people.
Mhm.
Now, for a long time, the historians disregarded these legends. They said, man, these crazy Indians, man, they've been sitting too close to the campfire. They've been smoking a peace pipe too much. Can't believe what they're saying. No, they weren't quite that crazy. Yeah, I know. I've known some crazy Indians, man. They're not really that crazy. And sure enough, these things did exist. And you know that old Indian greeting where people hold up their right hand and go, how? People think that means that you're supposed to show that you had no weapon. No, that's not why they did that. They did that to show how many fingers they had. They wanted to know how many fingers you had. Because they were terrified of the 6-fingered people. They were a threat to them. Now, these giants, when these giant skeletons were found, the people that unearthed them back in the 19th and early 20th century, they just assumed that these were Indians. They were actually not Indians. They were a different race of people. So what exactly were they? Well, here's another difference that they had, is that human beings have what was known as a suture right down the middle of the skull. So a wavy crack. And the skull is actually made up of several bones. But these giants did not have that suture down the middle. They have a suture across the side. And then, of course, they have this very elongated skull. They were actually very different. Now, there have been hundreds of cases of these reported in America in the 19th and early 20th century. And in almost all these cases, the articles say that these skeletons were turned over to the Smithsonian Institution. Well, the Smithsonian lost all of them, supposedly. They've been covering this up, and it's a shame. But we still have the contemporary news accounts, and I'm going to read some more of these to you from Wisconsin, because I think they're just amazing. And I'm going to start off with, here's a good one here. Here's a story from 1899, June 10th, 1899, Centralia Enterprise, St. Cloud, Wisconsin. An Indian skeleton was dug up on the farm of Matt and Joseph Leon, 1 mile south of St. Cloud, Sunday. There was nothing strange in the finding of an Indian skeleton, but this one was of a giant size, his frame measuring 7 feet. He must have been a man of note among his people, for he was buried in a large mound, 16 handsome arrows surrounding his body. The skull was brought to his city on an exhibition in one of the Main Street windows near the Huber gravel pit. Skeletons by the hundreds have been dug up. For the past several years, most of the bodies are in sitting position and face towards the east, towards the rising sun. All right, here's another giant skeleton. People thought it was an Indian. It was not an Indian. Now, it doesn't say how many fingers or toes it had, unfortunately. Now, here's another one from July 19th, 1906. Eau Claire city leader, Trempealeau, Wisconsin, finds skeleton of giant. Well-preserved implements are dug up in the city of Trempealeau. Excavators removing soil for a new sidewalk a half block south of Main Street uncovered the bones of what is believed to have been a mound builder. These people they buried their dead in giant mounds. As some well-preserved stone implements, weapons and pottery, and an oven, presumably of prehistoric origin. Ernest Bright made the discovery. He saw part of a skull protruding from the damp earth, and after digging a few feet below the surface, the spinal column and other bones were found. Trempealeau citizens say the bones are either those of an Indian or of unusual size, or of a mound builder, which the archaeological researchers have proved lived in the vicinity of Trempealeau. All right. Okay, well, there's another case that's from 1906. Now I'm going to read one more. Ferryville, 8-foot skeleton found. The skeleton of a prehistoric man, which assembled indicated that the being whose bones were found by C.H. Lawrence of Ferryville measured 8 or 9 feet in height. It has been unearthed near Viroqua and is attracting great curiosity and attention. This is October 1st, 1909. Together with the skeleton are many other bones of the same nature and larger than normal size. 3 complete jawbones have been found among the collection, in each of which all the teeth are intact and perfect, although in one of the specimens, molars has been shortened. The peculiarity of the teeth. All right, well, that's about all we got here. This is kind of an interesting book. It's from 2007, but that's just here in Wisconsin. They were found far and wide.
There's a gentleman who's going to Platteville, and they discussed the miner. There was a giant back in the early founding. This would be the early 1800s of Wisconsin when they were mining the lead out of Western, and there was a miner that they talked about him ducking everywhere he had to work bent over, 6 toes, 6 fingers, incredible strength. So that was 1800s, and there's pictures. You got a picture there in your paper of in the 1800s in Wisconsin, right here, 8 foot, 9 foot, 10 foot tall people. So they exist. They exist. And this particular guy was a loner. He was described as a loner, but loner, but because of his strength, he was able to do the work of 10 men in one day. So he was huge, but he had to work stooped because he was so tall.
Well, wow. I have not heard that, because there's nobody like that around anymore. The tallest person in the world right now is 8 feet tall. He lives in Turkey, and he doesn't have extra fingers or extra toes. He doesn't have extra teeth. He doesn't have an elongated skull. These things are all gone. However, the most salient case, the most amazing case of all of these giants is in Paracas, Peru. And back in 1929, somebody found over 300 of these giant elongated skulls. And you can look this up. I wanted to show you some pictures of these things. Now, the Smithsonian has no jurisdiction in Peru, so they can't cover this one up. And these are amazing finds. Now, I want to point out, the hair still is on some of these things. Now, the Peruvian people, almost all of them have black hair. Some of them have dark brown hair, but these skulls actually had red hair.
Red hair.
So they were a completely different race of people than the Peruvians. And now these things supposedly go back about 2,000 years. And now there was a DNA test conducted on these things. Where they took a molar out of it, and then they looked at the tooth pulp, so because it was preserved, it was encased in the tooth enamel, so they had a good specimen. And the results came in February of 2014, and the results were pretty amazing. They concluded, first of all, they could identify the mitochondrial DNA, which is the mother's DNA. They could not identify the father's DNA. They said there was a significant amount of non-human DNA in it, and they cross-checked it against a huge DNA database in Washington, D.C., and they couldn't figure out where this DNA was coming from. Well, what does that tell us? That's exactly what it's telling us in Genesis 6:4. It's human women with non-human fathers. That's what it's saying. Now, let's look. All right, let's look at Hebrews 2:5. Now, people have said, I've tried it, sometimes when I've talked about this with people, they've said, well, God wouldn't let that happen. There's no way God would allow that. Well, how do you know that? It doesn't say. I've been amazed by what God has already allowed that is verifiable. And we don't really know what he'll allow. I don't know why God allowed creatures like the T-Rex or the Velociraptor or the pterodactyl to roam the earth. I don't know. But they did. Now let's look at Hebrews 2:5. For he has not put the world to come, of which we speak, in subjection to angels. So that's one of the differences between this world and the next world. This world is subject to angels. The next world is not. Now you could say, in Hebrews 1:5, it's implied that angels are not called sons of God. All right, fair enough. I won't try to argue that point. But if you look at Job 38, verse 7, there's a case of sons of God, plural, Ben El, that are referred to I mean, these are spirit beings that are referred to as sons of God. It says the sons of God shouted for joy when the earth was created. Now people can be called sons of God, but this is before there were people. It's talking about spirit beings. Now we've just assumed, okay, now you know that the word Yahweh is singular, the word Elohim is plural. And we've assumed that the word Elohim refers specifically to two beings. It doesn't specifically say that. It might refer to many more. And I think that's evident from Job 38, verse 7. And I think that accounts for what was happening before the flood. So, what do we got now here? Let's move on to, how about Mark 13:25? Let's take a look at this. No, wait a minute. No, that's Matthew. All right. I'll back up to verse 24. But in those days, this is talking about after the tribulation, but in those days after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars of heaven will fall, and the heaven will be shaken. Well, this isn't talking about literal stars crashing into the earth. It's symbolic. And the same thing is described in Revelation 6. The stars will fall to the earth. It's not talking about literal stars. What is it talking about? This is a metaphor for spirit beings. This same word in the Greek is used 14 times in the book of Revelation, and in every case it's talking about spirit beings. This is talking about stars coming to the earth. That's what's been happening. Now, if you want to go to, all right, where is it? Well, okay, Matthew 24:37 is in the days, it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the end time. So this is going to be history repeating itself. And I think that might be happening again. Now, even though we don't have these giants on the earth anymore, I suspect that there may be Nephilim in a different form on the earth today. Now, I can't prove it, but one of the indicators that I have, I think, is the Rh negative blood type. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's only about 7% of the population have it. Very unusual. Now, blood types were not identified until 1901. Starting in 1901, it didn't happen all at once. So we don't know how far back that blood type goes. But it's highly suspect. And here's another thing that I want to look at. Let's look at Daniel 2, starting in verse 33. This is something that has been, I think, misinterpreted.
Mark, just one second. Taking a step back, do you recall the verse that says Noah was perfect in his generations?
Yeah.
Could that have maybe alluded to genetics?
Yes. I forgot to mention that. I'm glad you brought that up. Now, some people think that Noah was a pure white man, and he didn't want other races intermingling with the white race, and God was trying to preserve the white race. That's not what it's talking about. It is talking about a genetic corruption. I think it's talking about the Nephilim corrupting humanity. And it got to the point where if God did not destroy them, they could have actually ruined God's plan. Now, I'm speculating on that. I can't prove it, but there are these clues, right, like the one you just brought up. Now, like I said, we've got the physical evidence for these things, and now it's up to us to explain it. The answer's right there in the Bible. A lot of people have a hard time believing it because it just seems too far-fetched. But truth is stranger than fiction. The evidence is there. You just got to connect the dots. All right, now I want to look at Daniel 2. Go to 33. Now, this is the image that Nebuchadnezzar, this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had of this giant image. All right, you had the head of gold, the chest of bronze,
Silver.
or chest of silver, the waist of bronze, then you had the iron legs. All right, the head of gold was Babylon, that was Nebuchadnezzar. The chest of silver was Persia. The waist was Greece. Then you had the iron legs, which was Rome. The Roman Empire was divided between East and West. Then you had the feet, which is mixed with clay. Now, of course, in worldwide, they told us the clay was Eastern Europe and the iron was Western Europe, but there's another way of looking at this. What it says here in verse 34, wait a minute, where was it? Okay, no, let's look at verse 43. As you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. That word seed, talking about descendants, it's talking about progeny. Now, I think that this is talking about the Nephilim, and they're not going to really mix with regular people. That's what I'm seeing here now. That, of course, is speculation. You can interpret that your own way. But that's the way it looks to me. What else do we have here? Well, you know, I guess that pretty much does it.
We got something in the chat room. Hang on here. Okay. From the chat room, this is John Benzinger to everyone. At the resurrection, people neither marry nor are given in marriage. They will be like angels in heaven. Angels not married in heaven, but if they come to earth, could they be sexual relations? That was his comment.
All right, well, like I said, apparently there's two different categories of spirit beings. Not all spirit beings are angels. Now, like I said, Job 38:7 refers to spirit beings as sons of God. Genesis 6:4 uses the same term, sons of God. That's Ben El. So I think that could Genesis 6:4 definitely could be referring to spirit beings. Now, you could say, okay, angels don't marry in their spiritual state. Maybe in a physical state they could. Now, remember that angels did appear in human form on a few occasions.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, well, they visited.
I think someone on the phone is trying to say something.
Yes?
Hey, Don, Mark, this is Tom.
Tom Eldridge?
Yes, how you doing, Mark?
All right, man. I didn't think I'd hear from you again. That's great.
Oh, the old guy calls in. Can I chime in with a couple of comments in support of you?
Bring it on.
I have in front of me the Jewish Publication Society. I have the Hebrew on one side and the English on the other. And this can help because many people read just the English, the King James, or whatever they use, and they don't get a literal translation of what was in the Hebrew. So in that Genesis 6, and starting in verse 1, when men began to increase on the earth, daughters were born to them. Verse 2, translated from Hebrew, the divine beings saw how beautiful the daughters of men were and took wives from among them that pleased them. The Lord said, my breath shall not abide in man forever, since he too is flesh. Let the days allow him to be 120 years. And it was then and later too that the Nephilim, which are the offspring of the sons of God, which we call divine beings or fallen angels, produced these Nephilim. And it says in verse 4, and it was then and later too that Nephilim appeared on earth when the divine beings cohabitated with the daughters of men who bore them offspring. They were the heroes of old and the men of renown. So we get that translation there. Steve Quayle is a Christian. He has a very good book out on the giants, really well researched. And anybody can go buy it, and you could get a wealth of information from reading Steve Quayle's book. When I was in Israel, I went to Hebron. That's where the fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and they're buried. Okay, so that said, the people that live there that are very devout Orthodox Jews got to have a little bit of a private tour from them, and they showed me some ruins that had been the foundations of were some of the giants that lived there then. And they very much believe that this isn't some whimsical little fairy tale, but it's very real. The book of Enoch also supports this. Josephus also states that in his day, on display in Jerusalem were the remains of giants, or skeletal remains. Giants have been found all over the world, and even they're still discovering giants in Russia and Eastern Europe, as well as other places. So there is, I don't want to use the term I believe, I know there was something. I feel in the depths of my soul, with all my reading and experiences that I've had, that this is very real. You were right, Mark, when you said it's like stranger than fiction, so therefore people don't want to believe it. Well, people don't want to believe a lot of things, so I just leave it at that. But there is multiple evidence and writings that will support exactly what you're saying, as well as I'm going to give you a story. When one of my sons was in Iraq fighting the war there, he took down a very large guy. He and another guy. Actually, 4 smaller Iraqi soldiers tried to take this guy down, and he threw them off like they were little dolls. And so one of my sons and this other man, who were considerably bigger, took him down and bound him. And the man had 6 fingers. See, they didn't see his toes. He had footwear on, but he was large. 6 something anyway. I wouldn't say any bigger than. He was a big man. That's all was recorded, but with a strange thing of 6 fingers, and that was noted, and extremely strong. And the peculiar thing is when his head was smacked repeatedly into the ground, he said, "Thank you, Master. Thank you, Master." Well, if that wouldn't be a slightly demonic possession, I don't know what might be. But any event, I didn't want to say anything, but I thought in your support, in your defense, that there are these other things that Jewish publication in the Tanakh here has it transferred really well. It gives a little clearer explanation for this. And Steve Quayle's writings and Josephus' writings and the Book of Enoch all substantiate this. And you're right, National Geographic used to have information on this up until the early 1900s, and then it began to disappear. And they have brought bodies back from the Middle East in some of the wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, of giants on military cargo planes. So that's kind of not talked about as much, but it is out there. So they're still finding stuff today, and thought I would just bring that in, say hi to you. So good to hear from you, Mark, and Don. So good to be invited to listen in tonight from snowy Kansas City, Missouri.
Cool.
Well, all right. Well, like I said, I mean, these have been disregarded as Jewish legends, but the physical evidence is there. It's been covered up for a long time. It's only been in recent years that people have been starting to connect the dots. And in fact, about a year and a half ago, there was a documentary series on the History Channel called In Search of Giants, where they tried to search all these old news reports, over 200 of them, over 250. And they were trying to find these things, but they couldn't. But they were talking about how these things were supposedly turned over to the Smithsonian, where they promptly disappeared because they're covering them up.
Just want to remind the phones that to mute, you just hit *6, and that'll mute and unmute you. So yeah, go ahead.
Another thing I wanted to say about Genesis 6 is that, well, it says that these fallen ones, they were interested in human women. Now, why is that? Well, the thing is that these spirit beings were not created in God's image. We were created in God's image, but there's no evidence that any of the spirit beings were. And for that reason, they kind of have a love-hate relationship with people, and they want to be part of the human world. That's why they possess people. And yeah, they were simply attracted to human women. They wanted to be like people. And that's what was happening. I know it sounds strange, but like I said, truth is stranger than fiction, but it all adds up. Now, there's only one description of what any spirit being looks like in the Bible, and that's in Ezekiel 1. And it's talking about the cherubim, and it describes a being that has a combination of animal characteristics, but they don't look like human beings. They look in a way they do, but they don't look exactly like us.
So, Mark, there's also another place they're described, and that's in the book of Revelation. You know, white hair, skin like bronze, red glowing eyes.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not going to quibble over something like that, but the other verse that might support your thesis is, to which of the angels did God say, to you I've made you a son?
Yeah, it's Hebrews 1:5.
Exactly. So I knew you would know where it was, but I'm like the 30,000 foot level. So thank you for pinpointing. But that verse would definitely support your concept of, were they really made in his image? Were they really made to be his children, or just to be messengers / servants?
Well, in Genesis it says, "Let us make man in our image." Well, the spirit beings were already around by that time, so this was a new thing. They weren't made in our image. The spirit beings were not made in God's image. At least the angels were not. But like I said, how many members of Elohim were there? There might have been quite a few. Now, we've assumed that the Elohim refers to two beings. It doesn't say that. Now, I'm not a Trinitarian. I'm not saying there's three, but there might have been quite a few. That's just something else I'm going to throw out at you. Now, I'm not going to go over the book of Enoch. I don't think Enoch is 100% reliable.
Right. As you say, Enoch's got a lot of it. Chris Deweese looks like he's muted. He's unmuted. Did you do something?
Yeah, I usually use my phone. So, but what Lorraine just said is it's interesting how sometimes we see things that maybe they're not quite what we think, because the scripture said, to which of the angels did he say you are my son? So that doesn't support, it's contrary. This is angels aren't sons, right? He said to one he said he's a son. And the difficulty with Genesis 6, even as the gentleman read in the Tanakh, the JPS, it doesn't say that the Nephilim are the product of the relationships between the sons of God and the daughters of women. It says they're on the planet first. It says in those days, the Nephilim were on the earth when the sons of God went into the daughters of women. It's kind of not written the way you would say that they're the product of that. And a lot of this I'm about to say was actually on this august group about 2 or 3 years ago, and some other gentleman put forth like exactly the opposite of tonight. So it's kind of cool that non-hosts, all comers, so to speak. There's really big difficulties with the Nephilim, the end right before the flood, where Yahweh says, "That's it. I've had enough. The sons of God have gone into the daughters of men, so I'm going to destroy all life on the planet." Right?
Yeah.
Well, we have to assume that the Eternal was successful in his mission. So how do they show up on the other side of the flood? And Dr. Heiser is one of the premier people who support the Nephilim existing on other sides. And there's only two answers for that. One is somehow the flood did not destroy all of them, or it wasn't a global flood. And the other way is that somehow their seed mixed and got on the ark with one of the other daughters with one of the married, the daughter-in-law of Moses. But then why would Yahweh destroy the planet to get rid of these things if he was going to let them come in on the other side? You follow me? And
Yes,
Yeshua says that the angels don't procreate. He says it will be it'll be in the end as it was in the days of Noah, when they were marrying and they were giving in marriage,
Okay.
which would mean that we would have to wait for these giants to come back and try to eat our women before we have to worry about the end of days, right? Because he's mirroring the end of days with the flood. And I have another point that I just launched a lot of stuff, so I have another one that's kind of heady, but I mean, there are lots of difficulties, roadblocks, in order to get these creatures to continue to exist in contemporary times when they were destroyed, in the days of Noah.
Can I interject here some thoughts? This is Don sitting here at Mission Control, which is like next to Mark. We look today, we've got GMO food, we've got GMO genetically modified animals, we're growing meat in labs, we're doing all this heinous stuff. And I don't want to give too much reputation to the Book of Enoch. I have read a lot of it, the Ethiopian version. And in there, Enoch is talking to God or somebody, angelic type. And these angels or fallen demons were going to Enoch, asking him to go before God and plead their case. And in there, Enoch asks, and God, or in the book, responds, "Don't worry about them. They have done a great evil by giving mankind information they're not supposed to have." That was one place. Another place it says, "Don't worry about them, for their job was to intercede for you, not you interceding for them, for they will suffer their penalty in the full." So, I mean, it kind of goes along. What was happening before the flood? Did they have genetic modification? Did they change the seed of the plants? Because, the plants got wiped out too. Everything got wiped out except for what was on the ark. So I think mankind had gotten to the point where he had just totally screwed everything up. That God's like, okay, fine, let's hit the reset button and end this.
Okay, so on that, every time this comes up, it very quickly turns into a kind of an apologetic on the big book of Enoch, and I'll lose that all day long because it's not scripture, so I don't read it. The Tanakh, the complete Tanakh is the Septuagint, and the book of Enoch didn't make it in there because it wasn't written yet. It's not written by the Enoch that we think that carried it over on the ark. It's just attributed to him. But the heady part of this, the part that we all should really kind of meditate on, is that if the planet was destroyed the first time because of things that were outside of our control, by celestial beings coming down and corrupting the planet in some fashion, then Yeshua says the same thing's going to happen at the end of days. And that means that Yahweh is actually destroying the earth based upon things that are outside of our control. In my view, I believe that it has to do with our sins. And I think that, Don, the things that you're saying have a lot of validity, because we're not supposed to mix kinds, and we're not really supposed to toy with nature, with the creation as we have been. But I think that's our fault. I think we're doing that. We're the ones who are trying to say, I want to have that bite of that apple. I want to have this knowledge. I want to do I. And it's our narcissism and our selfishness that's going to bring about the destruction of the planet, not the external input of fallen celestial beings. And asterisk, I don't in any way, shape, or form disagree with the fact that giant human beings or something existed. That is in the Torah, that is in the Tanakh. There were giants; they do exist. I just don't hold to the belief that our fate is in the hands of these fallen beings coming down and trying to lay with our women. I think that it's our fault. So
Well, and
you
can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh yeah, you're just saying and a lot.
All right, so so to kind of support that thought is think about the technological advances we've made in the last 100 years or even 200 years in comparison, and thinking about people who could live to be 700 years old. And what would be the implications of that? Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two, think about to whom the Tanakh was written. It was written to a people that were coming out of bondage in Egypt who things had to be described or explained to them in a way that they could grasp. Could they understand genetic engineering? Could they understand tampering with the computer code or whatever you want to call it that God has established that creates human beings and all life on this planet? No. It's just that's I don't want to say it's allegory or symbolic writings, but maybe that's really what it boils down to. And then there was manipulation of the DNA. There was all sorts of GMO and nonsense to the point where God said, "Look, Noah's the only one whose code is not corrupt. There's not much I can say about the women that his sons marry, but this is where we're at." And to completely clean the slate, start over, that's what he had to do. And in the long run, does it really matter? Does this whole race and corruption and nonsense matter? No. What really matters is, do we have a good relationship with each other? Do we have a good relationship with God the Father and his Son? And yes, there are all sorts of impediments that are being created, food-wise, genetics, blah, 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 blah. There's a long list of things. But can we overcome them? Yes. I mean,
That's the
yeah.
I don't mean to hijack too much here, but the pattern, because this topic took on a life of its own in our assembly a couple of years ago, and so I'm like, well, you know what? So many people believe this. I'm going to just take a deep dive and I'm going to check it out, and it's fascinating stuff. But the pattern of Scripture is that you have mankind created, and then you have mankind destroyed because of mankind. Then you have the Hebrew people brought out of Egypt, and they're saved, and then they fall away because of their own fault. And this cycle continues throughout as they get cast into Babylon for not taking the Jubilees, and then they get brought back, and then they fall away again, and then they get brought back, and then we have Messiah, and then we fall away again. And I just think that same pattern is the thing to follow, not.
And Brother Chris, I think you've nailed it and articulated it in a way that I couldn't. That maybe we were to fault. Maybe we had the technological advancement before the flood and created the whole mess to begin with, and it was the best way that Moses could describe it in the Tanakh as to what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, we corrupted ourselves through science, whatever it may be, pre-flood, who knows, who cares? But the cycle continues, like you said. We are to fault. Mankind is to fault for the separation between us and God.
Can I add something, John?
Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, hi. In Genesis 30, verse 37, and Jacob took rods of green poplar and a hazel and chestnut tree and peeled white strakes in them and made the white appear which was in the rods. He changed his sheep. He changed his goats. He foiled his father-in-law. So when we talk about genetic engineering, many times people look back at the ancient peoples as being backwards or ignorant, and I think quite the difference in my learning of people. In addition to that, you remember that God also sent Noah. He sent them in pairs of 7 of the clean animals, or, and the unclean, he sent them in pairs. Now, the thing was that he selected them. He knew that those animals that he was going to send, whether reptilian, fowl of the air, or that walked on the land, were pure in their generations as well. And it's impossible for me to, in a short period of time, to go and scurry around and find the books and the research of others that would substantiate this. Great harm was done by mixing kinds, and today we have people mixing human DNA with animal DNA to enhance it, and pretty soon we'll be cannibalists. Now, I think there is quite a bit, I disagree only in a gentle way, that the things that are going on with our animal husbandry is pretty soon going to destroy a food supply, and is going to make it for anybody that follows biblical principles to be even able to eat it. Mixing animal DNA and plant DNA, mixing human DNA and animal DNA to get production. And so there is something to be done. Yes, salvation comes through belief in Jesus Christ, Yeshua the Messiah. But our daily, day-to-day life is being impeded every day by scientific research, by the inspiration. If you say, well, they're not back here, they're not doing it. Well, yes, the demonic influence is there in our world. It is changing our world. It's influencing people who have abandoned God. And when they abandon God, there is another God, a lesser God. And that's the demons, the fallen angels that are still active, and God allows it. So, what happened then is certainly repeating itself and will happen. And it'll ultimately lead to such destruction, whether it's by man or by God, that you were right. I guess your name is Chris. When you said man is pretty much doing a number on himself, that's correct, because God says, if I don't interfere, if I don't intervene, there will be no flesh found alive on this orb we call home. So, they were meddling before the flood. They were teaching many, many things. God killed the animals, everything that breathed air then. He did it because they were so contaminated and polluted at the time. He had to stop even that, except what he allowed Noah to put on the ark of what he sent him. Noah didn't get to choose it. So it's an interesting point to consider that. It may be academic to argue about any of this or to discuss it, but it's not really. It's just something that another aspect, another color on the palette of things that we need to know when we study Scripture. That's just, I'm 71 years old, and at these arguments and these things I've been down through ever since I was a young boy. And I just come to certain conclusions and live with it today. So there you go, Mark, Don.
Thanks. I just had a couple more verses to cover, and then I'm going to wrap it up. But I wanted to go back to 1 Peter 3, starting at verse 19. Christ went and preached to the spirits in prison who formerly were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. Now it says the spirits in prison. Now, who were these spirits and why were they in prison? First of all, this word for spirits, it's the word pneuma. It's used hundreds of times. It's not the word for angels. That's a different word. That's angelios. And it's talking about spirit beings that are not angels, and they're being restrained, they're being put in prison before the flood. That's what it's talking about in Genesis 6. Now I want to go to Jude, verse 6. Why were they in prison? And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own habitation, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for judgment on the great day. Because what was their proper domain? They had left the spirit world and infiltrated the human world. I think that's what it's talking about. Now, you can interpret it the way you want, but I think that's the way what it's talking about. How many different ways can you interpret it? That's about it. That's about all I had to say. Now, as Chris was saying, why would God allow these things to return after the flood? But it specifically says in Genesis 6:4 that they were before the flood and after. Now, why did he allow them to return? I don't really know. That's a good question. But that's what it says. And they did return, and that's what the physical evidence shows, that they did come back. Now, these spirit beings are still around. Not all of them. Some of them have been restrained, but there's others besides. That's the only explanation I can give you.
My answer to that one is if you look at the New American Standard Exhaustive Concordance, or if you look at other ones, sometimes it says fallen ones, but other times it calls them fellers, as if they were strong warriors or something. And the other translation is tyrants. So they could be, because the definition of them in Genesis 6:4, it actually defines the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men as men of renown. So that verse is actually defining the word Elohim for us. It's saying that, or not Elohim, Nephilim for us. It's saying that they are men of renown, men, ish, not hybrids, and that they are actually like Nimrod or powerful people like Stalin or Hitler. So that makes sense when the Israelites crossed over, the spies crossed over, Caleb and the boys, and they said, "Oh my goodness, these guys are huge," as if they have huge armies, they have huge estates. There's nothing we're going to be able to do to them. But again, it doesn't negate the fact that there are, Goliath was Goliath. He was a huge guy, right? Right? He wasn't just a little Napoleon dude with a big army. He was a really big guy. But there's another way to think of the word, to where they're giants, the way we would talk like Babe Ruth was a giant and stuff like that. But that's my answer. I just chimed in again, even though I put myself on mute and said I wouldn't. Sorry for hijacking your call, man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a couple of people having trouble with their microphones. Just a quick thing. On the bottom of your screen, you go down, you see the pop-up bar. Next to that, on the end, will be a microphone. And then next to the microphone, there's an up arrow. If you click on that up arrow, it'll give you a list of what is available for your PC to use for a microphone. You have to actually select your mic if you have multiple inputs. And those people on the phone, please use your *6 because it really makes a ton of noise if you don't. All right.
I agree
with
I was going to throw a verse in there, and then Paul's going to talk. But in Revelation 11:18, it talks about the nations being angry. Your wrath came, as did the time for the dead to be judged, and to give your bondservants the prophets their reward, as well as to the saints and those who fear your name, to the small and great, and to destroy those who destroy the earth. So this might link back to, the whole concept of messing with the DNA and creating all this GMO nonsense and other things that make it hard for us to keep God's food laws. And on that, I'm going to hand over to Paul.
Good evening, everyone. This is just even tagging along with that. Just thinking, and I don't know how much different people feel this, but most of us really believe that the pre-flood civilization was quite advanced. I personally think all the relics and the remains of it are buried at the bottom of the ocean because the flood buried it all. But, we find little bits and pieces, like you're saying, skeletons and other stuff. But that's just me for that part. But just kind of thinking a little bit here as far as that advancement, and mankind is now tinkering with that same kind of thing. It has been for many years. The most recent thing that I think that probably accelerated that opportunity was back in the 80s with Chernobyl and that massive release of radiation in Russia that when the reactor melted down. And maybe some of you remember this or not, but they had a 60 Minutes episode with Ed Bradley doing the reporting. And the effects that the radioactivity had on the populations that were surrounding, not immediately there, the ones that were affected and yet survived. And it was too graphic for them to show on television at the time. You could probably see it somewhere buried on YouTube or somewhere, who knows. But as far as their cameras were inside of the, I guess you'd call them medical laboratories. And they had these, some they were able to show, basically not the entire thing, but the specimen bottles of stillborn children that were born of the parents and the families around there that had been affected pretty strongly by the radioactivity. And it was scrambled. It had scrambled the DNA quite a bit. It had manipulated the DNA quite a bit. And I know a lot of you realize that there's 4 basic proteins that make up all the chromosomes and all the genes, G, A, T, C. You know, and that's for everything. That's for fish. That's for animals. That's for plants. It's all the same protein, just infinite amounts of combinations to make us what we are. And it was kind of just the stuff that they were able to show. You only can imagine what the other stuff was that they weren't showing, but they were showing, these were basically what we've talked about, sort of like chimeras. They were stillborn babies with the head of a baby or a human, and they had the bodies of a fish. I mean, this wasn't fake. This was stuff that they were, you know, different animal combinations or different combinations of things we would recognize as animals or fish or creatures that had human attributes with it. And this was because of the radiation affecting the combination, either breaking down or rearranging those proteins randomly and creating these, obviously not living beings, but to that extent. And I think that was probably the big impetus for scientists to start, ooh, look what happened. All this radiation did these things. And they're studying, obviously, the genetic makeups, the chromosomes and stuff, as far as the sampling, as far as autopsies, whatever you want to call them, that kind of accentuated and accelerated this study. And they're probably, and again, this is just me talking, but it does, I guess you could say, it makes a little more sense, that they are accelerating that by doing this genetic modification now, starting off with the simple things and slowly compounding and increasing those things. So as in we're, you know, as it was in the days of Noah, I think we are definitely in that neighborhood. I wouldn't say we're quite there yet because they're not making things that are living, breathing, you know, whatever now. I don't think we're that far from it. But Lorraine's going, she's going, ooh, she's going to have something to go to say with this too. So thanks for your time.
Well, there is genetic engineering going on right now, and it's pretty creepy. And like, I think that could apply to what it says about it being in the days of Noah. People are trying to find eternal life.
No, I was going to mention the days of Noah. Why don't you look back to that?
That is Matthew 24:37.
Right, go back to that, because I have a different take on that.
All right.
I have a different take that just as in the days of Noah, they're going to be caught by surprise. Not so much that they were evil, but that go back a verse or two.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll go to verse 36.
Yeah.
But of that day and the hour, no one knows. No, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as in the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of Son of Man.
Continue reading.
All right. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark.
Right. I'm saying, well, I think, I mean, it could be different ways, but my take on that is God saying, just as they were surprised by the flood,
All right.
just as they were surprised by, oh, my world descended, is going to be the same thing with the coming of Christ. Everyone's going to be doing their thing, and all of a sudden, whoa, check out this.
Can you hear me?
It's going to come that quick.
All right.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I hear voices.
Can you
Yeah,
hear me?
Mark's trying to talk. The other Mark.
Yeah. And kind of to build on top of what you just said there, I think if you look at the scripture about that period, it says that the imaginations of men was evil continually. Men. It was men. We're not talking about DNA corruption. We're talking about corrupt minds, and that's where I would agree with Chris. It's not about DNA corruption, even though that's going on now. Yeah, sure, but in all sorts of ways. But it talks about man. The mind of man was evil continually, drinking blood. They were doing what they were doing was corrupt things in their mind. The imaginations of men's minds was going wild with evil, and they had no good. There was no good in them, and that's all they thought about all the time. And that's when I think he pulled the plug. But so I'm not in that camp, but definitely I agree with you guys. I believe in giants. I believe there were six-fingered guys, but it's kind of weird how all these famous scientists and these men of renown in science find these things, and there's not one on display anywhere. Everybody, thousands of stories of people talking about this. Well, why wouldn't you put the bones in a box, put them on display in a museum so everybody can see them? Something funny going on there, guys. There's no way that all these people have found all this stuff, and you wouldn't put it in a museum for everybody to see. Just back in like you were talking about, back in 1900, they found this stuff. Well, what'd they do with it? Oh, let's rebury it. We don't want anybody to see this. No, if there was discoveries about that, it would be out right now for everybody to see. But I believe they exist. I'm just saying, it's funny how all these people have found this stuff and nothing's there on display, because the bones would last forever. Mummies are there forever.
They have been on display in Peru. Not in America though, but there's, like I said, there's hundreds of accounts, and they can't all be fake. There's no way that all these newspaper accounts are fake. And
Well,
I have a bunch of pictures, so you can look these things up, of these giant skulls.
Okay. We have the great Mike Waters has walked over with his computer in hand. Yes, Mike.
Well, I was just looking up the Caracas elongated skull DNA, latest 2018. And of course, now we need to remember, if it's a XX, female,
Yeah.
it only has the mitochondrial DNA.
Yeah.
Males will give you
Mike, are you reading InfoWars again, Mike?
No, I'm reading the,
nice.
oh, I should,
Well, you got the other computers online over there.
no, I can,
I'm saying,
I
you can look
can
it up
name
on there and you
names.
can
No,
share it.
this is, the L.A. Marzulli is kind of fluffy, his stuff, but there's been actual, real scientists studying this all. And so the latest is that it's mitochondrial DNA, U2E, which is a Proto-Germanic, Proto-Balto-Slavic DNA. And the latest ones they found have reddish, blondish hair.
Yeah.
So they're originated in, like the Gothic peoples in the Middle East, the Gothic tribes.
Yeah.
And so that's where but the idea is that they migrated.
Yeah.
And intermingled with American Indians.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well, that's a long ways to travel.
yeah.
This is over 2,000 years ago.
Well, the people traveled that far then. The Phoenicians were all over the world.
Yeah.
They did travel the world 3,000 years ago, we know from the Bible.
Yeah.
So the DNA now on the Y haplogroup, it fits in with the R Y haplogroup, which is in the Russians and Celtic peoples.
Yeah.
So it goes along that they come from the same DNA as the people that were the proto Gothic peoples. And then when you get into the Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon man, that's DNA is heavily in the European peoples also.
Mm-hmm.
So you think Arnold Schwarzenegger, you just think of, Neanderthal. He probably has a high rate, but it's on the average 2% in the European peoples. And so that's where this DNA, it's been identified between, the three that Marzulli tested were females, so they would have no male DNA.
Well, to support Mark, is it Jungerman?
Younger men.
Younger men.
Same way that the J sounds the same as it does in Yeshua.
Okay. Thanks for the heads up, man. So Mark was basically saying, well, why don't we see this stuff displayed? Because if we think that these people that are taller with extra rows of teeth and fingers are in theory better because they're 10 times stronger or whatever, then those of us who don't have those abilities in a sense are devolving, right? So if we look at the law of thermodynamics, where over time energy dissipates, and I know I'm thoroughly like butchering that, but in theory, you know, it's not like systems become better over time. They lose energy and they devolve.
You're talking about entropy. That things
Yeah.
chaos increases. We don't evolve into something better.
Right. So I'm trying to thank you. I'm trying to explain it in like normal people terms. Thanks, Chris. Yes.
Hey, I take that personally.
Dude, we're on the same level. I'm trying to be the Apostle Paul here, you know, speak in terms that everyone can understand. So that being said, that's why the stuff isn't on display, because then it completely undermines the narrative that that we are getting better, when in fact we are, as a people, we are, you know, losing our genetic information and becoming worse with disease, etc., etc. Yeah. The other thing I was going to throw in there is, if we're made in the image of God for a specific purpose, meaning to, yes, we've got the spirit of man within us, but to have the ability to contain the spirit of God, because you become baptized, you accept the seed, and in theory you're growing the spirit of God within you to become closer. If you contaminate the container, this is a theory that I have, if you contaminate the container through food or whatever it may be, it makes it harder for the Spirit of God to dwell within you. That, again, that's my theory. And so as we see society changing around us and how things have become, how do I put this politely?
Messed up.
Even more so, it becomes even harder to understand, well, how does that person, how do they even process that thought? I mean, where does that emotion or that thought come from? Because I'm not even there. I can't even grasp it. It's not that I'm stupid. It's just I can't make the leap from you know, someone wearing a hat to, you know, racism. You know, it's just ridiculous stuff like that. And so it leads me to believe that with all these other aspects, whether it be visual, things we eat, things we breathe, we drink, or we watch, or we meditate upon, can corrupt the container to the point where it makes it hard for the Spirit of God to indwell, that we see the fruits of that. So,
That's interesting.
yeah, I know. Well,
James, you had something?
Hey, Mark,
Yeah.
finally here. I got in here probably about almost 8:15, and you may have already brought up this verse, Jude 6 and 7. Did you bring that up?
What was that?
Jude 6 and 7.
Yes, I did that just recently, just a little while.
You did, okay, because I missed hearing it.
Yeah, they did not keep their habitation. That's
Yeah,
why they
so
had to be restrained.
yeah, so and I know Yeshua said that the angels in heaven do not marry. He didn't say they could not.
Right, no, I mean, they're in their spiritual state. No, they don't marry. But
Right.
that's one of the reasons why they wanted to take the form of humans.
And my wife has a question. Let's see if you can answer that. And she says, how come it's always males that are the giants? No female giants. I don't know the answer to that question.
Well,
Because they don't need. It's because they don't mate and have kids. They don't have females because they don't mate.
Mike Waters is just reading that the genetic material came from a giant that was a female. That's why there was no male genetics. Okay, and Dennis Gonzalez got his hand up. Hopefully his mic's gonna work now.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
You can hear me.
yes.
Finally. I can't hear Mark now. Mark, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, because I can. I thought the first part of your presentation was excellent, straight to the scripture. When it came to the speculation part, I had a couple of questions.
Okay.
First of all, I think we agree that the angels are spirit, right? I mean, as already described. I think John mentioned something in Matthew, Mark and Matthew were the angels. They're like the angels in heaven that neither marry or given in marriage. So they're spiritual.
Right.
And the giants, if they did intermarry, somehow the spirit mated with a physical, and they came up with beings that are not spirit, obviously, because they could kill them. I mean, Caleb drove them away. Bashan, the king of Og, had a bed 13 feet long and 6 feet wide, and they killed him. So there are obviously some things that can be killed. They're not spirit. But a more fundamental issue, I think, in my mind, is if you say, again, I'm not saying you're saying that, if you say that, and I've heard this before, that angels intermarried with women, that means a spirit mingled with flesh and produced siblings, okay? Right? That's what we're saying here.
Yeah.
Now, if that's the case, we do know that God is more powerful than angels, and he created them, and he's spirit. So long term, are you saying that God mated with Eve with Mary to produce Christ? Because he is definitely, if the angels can do that, God can do it and have the Son of God come through him.
Well,
so I'm just wondering.
Well, Christ was born of the Spirit. And then here's another thing that I wanted to point out that I forgot to mention is that Abraham and Sarah were visited by angels twice. They took the form of humans, and they ate food. They ate a meal together.
Sure.
They could do the things that people did. Even Christ ate food after he was resurrected. He walked through a wall, but he also ate food. They ate fish together.
Yes.
He was resurrected. He was a spirit being. They could still do that.
Well, I understand. I'm just saying I don't think we'll ever get the answer to this one, obviously, but it's kind of interesting conversation because it's not a new theory. I've heard that before. Angels came to earth. And as far as somebody brought up, in the end, it's neither here nor there. It's kind of interesting. But as someone mentioned, it's a relationship with God the Father and Jesus Christ. But there are more, if we say spirit mingled with flesh and produce siblings, that's kind of an interesting thing. And I'm not going to lose sleep over it if you believe that. But I don't think scripturally it's defensible from my viewpoint, right? So, but the rest of the stuff you gave about races and all that is right on, I thought, and I appreciate that.
Well, I'm trying to say that, like I said, there's all these myths, and some people are trying to say that there's certain races that are more evolved than other races. That's not true because we all have the same origin, and that's verifiable. I'm just trying to dispel some of these racist myths that we've heard.
I do appreciate that because you're right. Color was not mentioned there.
Right.
There are other scriptures, but that's okay. It's kind of late now, so.
Yeah. All right. Well, okay. And now, like the second part about the Nephilim. I mean, I'm not saying your salvation is hanging in the balance. I just think it's interesting. I think it's worth discussing. That's all.
All right. Anyway, I got to get ready for bed, so I'm a little bit an hour ahead, as you know.
Right,
here in
right.
Michigan.
Well, thank
you-
you for coming in. We appreciate it.
Yeah, everybody have a nice evening.
Hey,
Sleep
Dennis.
well. Happy
Hey,
Sabbath.
Dennis,
Yeah.
I feel sorry for you. Staying up just too late.
Well, I had to listen to Mark, so.
This is Al.
All right,
Al's,
goodbye.
Al's always willing to take one for the team.
Yeah. All right, bye-bye.
Hey, goodbye.
If you-
Mark, a couple things to think about, Mark. What evidence would you provide us with to show that angels or spirits of any kind, other than God himself, has the power to create life? Because we know that life comes only from God.
Yes.
So if we start to say that spirits have the power to create life apart from the approval of the Father, then they could continue to do that throughout history and even today. But I don't see any place throughout Scripture that provides support for the idea that angels or spirits can, in fact, create life. But that would have to be true if your theory is true. The second thing I would like to mention is kind after kind. There is never, ever been a situation where cats can produce dogs. And so we have to say that how can kind after kind be consistent if spirits can produce giants?
Well, I mean, we don't. I mean, I don't know what kind means as far as the spirit world goes. But now in John 1:3, it says all things were made through him. So people have tried to say spirit beings can't create living things, but no, it doesn't say that Christ made everything. Christ did not literally make everything. It says they were made through him. He created things that made things. Now people have created things, not living things. But now I'm looking at empirical evidence here. Now this is speculation, but we can see the fingerprints of God on certain things because there's a conflict between good and evil on every level of creation, from the spirit world to the human world to the animal kingdom and the botanical world, even the microbial world. No, but there's beautiful things and then there's things that are just hideous monstrosities. And I'm just trying to put this together, trying to make sense of it. Now, if you see certain beautiful things, like let's say you see, if you smell a beautiful flower, you know that that's a creation of God. When you see like ducks crossing the road with the mallard in front, followed by the drake and the little baby ducklings, you know that only a good God could make such a beautiful thing. When you look at something like, let's say, a crocodile, you have to wonder, is that the same creator that made the beautiful things? Well, my guess is no. I think that there's a conflict there. I think that and the Bible doesn't say that Christ literally created everything. It says all things were created through him, not by. So I'm just saying, I'm trying to make sense out of the creation here because there is a conflict between good and evil. There is, and we don't know how many beings make up Elohim. Also, I do think, just by looking at the creation itself, I think that God did allow